So let's take a look at the generic parts or the characteristics of our sine and cosine graph. Our midline for our sine and cosine graph is typically at y equals 0. Our maximum for our sine and cosine graph is typically at 1. And our minimum for our typical sine and cosine graph is at -1. So now that we have our boundaries set, let's actually go ahead and do the 5 critical points for the graph of sine. Sine starts at the midline. So our first point for sine will be on the midline at 0. For sine, we're then going to go up to the maximum, back to the midline, down to the minimum, and back to the midline, creating a curve that looks like this. Our typical cosine graph starts away from the midline, normally at the maximum. We then move to the midline, down to the minimum, back to midline, and up to the maximum, making a curve that looks like this. So please remember what the basic sine and cosine functions look like, because we're about to change it. The general formulas for sine and cosine are shown below. Please make sure you write this down. You need to have this in your notes. So let's look at each individual piece independently. A stands for amplitude, or a vertical, an amplitude is a vertical stretch or compression. B stands for the period change, or a horizontal stretch or compression. We aren't going to be testing on those, but we wanted you guys to know what that meant. C is a phase shift, or a horizontal shift, as you guys normally hear it. And the last one is D, is a midline change or a vertical shift. So whenever you see different values in places of A, B, C, or D, these are the types of things that will be changing with the graph. So when you're graphing trig functions, these are the steps that you need to follow. The first step is that you're going to identify and draw your midline. Like so. The second step you're going to do is identify and draw the maximum and minimum. And then you need to plot the first 4 measurements on the x-axis. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Notice that each one goes up by 1/2. So pi over 2 is 1/2 pi. Then we have 2 over 2, which is just 1 pi, or just pi itself. 3 pi over 2 is really 1.5 pi, and then 2 pi is 4 over 2 pi. The next thing we need to do is plot the 5 critical points. Sine starts at the midline, and cosine starts at the maximum or minimum. So sine starts at the midline, moves up, back to midline, down to the minimum, and back to the midline. Whereas cosine Starts typically at the maximum, moves down to the midline, down to the minimum, back to the midline, and back to the maximum. The fifth step is just to draw a curve through your 5 critical points. Okay, so let's actually follow those instructions for the first step. So when we look at our function, the first thing that we want to do is identify and draw your midline. The midline comes from the d value. Notice that d is all the way at the end of our function, and in this case, it's a positive 3. So we're going to draw in our midline at positive 3. So 1, 2, 3. Our next step is to identify and draw in the maximum and minimum. Our maximum and minimum comes from our A value, or our amplitude. In this case, we don't have any amplitude written, so we can assume that our amplitude is 1. So we're going to go 1 above the midline, and 1 below the midline. Now is when we're going to actually draw or plot the first 4 measurements on the graph. We already have those written for you. The next step that we gave you guys was to plot the 5 critical points. Sine starts at the midline and cosine starts at the maximum or minimum. We have a sine function, so we're going to be starting at the midline at 0. So we start at our midline, we move up to our maximum, back to the midline, down to the minimum, and back to the midline. Our fifth step is to draw a curve through your 5 critical points. And there we've drawn our sine function. Now that we've drawn a sine function, let's go ahead and look at a cosine function. Again, we want to look at our midline first. So identify your midline. Our d value is where our midline comes from. D was equal to -4. So now we're going to draw in our midline. Our midline is supposed to be at -4 because d was -4. So 1, 2, 3, -4 is right here. Our next step is identify and draw the maximum and the minimum. Again, our maximum and minimum comes from our amplitude, our A value. In this case, nothing is written, so we will assume that it's a 1. So we are moving 1 above our midline and 1 below our midline. The next step for you guys is to plot the first 4 measurements on the graph. Again, we've already given you those. So we're going to move into number 4. Plot the 5 critical points. Sine starts at the midline, cosine starts at the maximum or minimum. In this case, we are starting at the maximum for cosine. We're going to move to the midline, move down to the minimum, back to the midline, and finish at the maximum. Step 5, draw a curve through your 5 critical points. And now we've drawn our cosine graph with a vertical shift of -4. The next thing we want to do when we're looking at trig functions is how to actually write a function from a graph that's given. Identify the midline. That will give you your d value. Identify the maximum and the minimum in order to allow you to find your A value. This is the distance between the midline and the maximum, or the midline and the minimum. The third step is going to be identifying whether you have a sine or a cosine graph. The easiest way to remember is that sine starts on the midline. Cosine will either start at the maximum or the minimum, but it will be changing with reflections that we're going to talk about next class. And the fourth step is just to write as y equals a times sine of x plus d, or y equals a times cosine of x plus d. So let's actually try to do one of these. Our first step is to identify the midline. That will tell us our d value. Our midline in this case is what cuts the graph perfectly in half, which is at a positive 2. Therefore, d equals 2. Our next step is to identify the maximum and the minimum. Here's our maximum and our minimum. The distance between the midline and the maximum and the midline and the minimum will give us our a value. In this case, that distance was 1, so a was equal to 1. Our next step is to identify whether it's sine or cosine. Sine starts on the midline. So since this is starting away from the midline, we know that this is a cosine graph. Our fourth step is to write as y equals a times sine of x plus d, or as y equals a times cosine of x plus d. We know that this is a cosine function, so we're going to be using y equals a, which we know is 1, times cosine of x, plus our d value, which is positive 2. We can also write this without the 1, as the 1 is not needed. Now that we've looked at a cosine function, let's look at a sine function. So write the function for the following graph. Again, let's follow our steps. Identify the midline. Our midline is going to split our graph perfectly in half. So our midline is at -4. So d equals -4. Our next step is to identify the maximum and the minimum. Our maximum is here. Our minimum is here. The distance between the maximum and the midline is a, and the distance between the midline and the minimum is also a. In this case, that distance was 1, so a equals 1. Our next step is to identify whether this is sine or cosine. If it starts at the midline, it is sine. In this case, we started at the midline, so we know that this is a sine function. And our fourth step is to write as y equals a times sine of x plus d, or a times cosine of x plus d. Again, we know that this is a sine function, so let's substitute in the values that we know. Y equals a, our value is 1, so we're not going to write that, times sine of x, minus 4, because we're not going to be adding a -4. We're just going to write that as -4. At the end of your notes, please put a star to indicate to us that you have watched the video. Thank you and have a great evening.